So it's really nice to have an opportunity to talk about Korean drama. Traditionally, I don't really write about TV. I tend to write about cinema, and I also write about K-pop. I think we get so much more Korean drama than when I started watching it about 10 years ago. And this was largely inspired by Tale of the Nine-Tailed, which is quite a recent Gumiho K-drama, and its sequel, Tale of the Nine-Tailed 1938. There's kind of rumors that there might be another series, but we don't know. We don't know. Korean don't tend to do like sequels, so they don't like have seven seasons or 20 seasons of anything. It tends to be 12 or 16 episodes, or that's how it used to be. So the kind of talk today is structured in three parts, and I just want to say that this is something I just started working on. So I'm really happy for comments, suggestions in terms of, you know, where I go with this work and whether you agree with my argument or not. So first of all, I'm going to talk about East Asian Gothic. This is my main work, and I've been working on a book called East Asian Gothic Cinema for about 8 years now. I hope it will come out one day. So the publishers, I wanted to do like East Asian Gothic generally, but the publishers wanted me to limit it to cinema. So as I said, this is the first time I'm really talking about K-dramas, but I teach media at Kingston. So we do TV with students, and I use some of this with my students, but not this particular talk. So what is East Asian Gothic? What are the debates around it? Is it an appropriation of a kind of Western term used to explain a non-Western cinema, that, as some people have argued? And then I want to go on to the Gumiho and the changing shape of the Gumiho. And I want to kind of preface this by saying I am learning Korean. I do have dyslexia, so I do have problems with pronunciations, but I am trying. And finally, to kind of think at the beginning what it might be to define the Gothic Gumiho as a particular genre rather than just as a character. So, as I said, there are lots of definitions of Gothics. The most central of them is the work of Fred Botting and David Punter, who wrote, so as people know with the Gothic, these are kind of seminal books on the Gothic. So the idea of monstrosity, the idea of excess, but also the idea of it restricted to a particular post-Enlightenment period in time. So very much located within time and place. And so what you might argue is that the Gothic is kind of different these days and that it has transformed itself throughout centuries. I want to kind of suggest that by thinking about East Asian Gothic as a kind of appropriation of a Western term, we're not actually thinking through the kind of exchanges between East and West. We're reading it within a binary, and I think binaries just don't work. So I want to problematize the work I've written on East Asian Gothic by bringing in some earlier influences from China and from Japan. China is the earliest one, and then we go on to influences of Japan on Western art, aesthetics and architecture. Baldrick says it's restricted to Europe and America, so it's only in this one place. So this is the argument that it's not global genre. You can only use it in terms of Europe or the Americas. Fowler says Gothic is a mode, it's a way of speaking, it's a type of discourse. Nakawara is a way of writing. Hughes, his work on Japanese cinema has probably been the most influential on me. His work on Japan has been the most influential on me. And he talks about as a translation term, which identifies similarities in both cultures without kind of just reading it through the Western lens. So I want to start by suggesting that The Tale of Genji is the world's first Gothic novel. So this is before we get to the kind of first cycle of Gothic texts. The Tale of Genji, written by a woman circa 1010, is considered the world's first novel. It features many spirits and ghosts and has a kind of Gothic framing to it. So this is before the term Gothic is used. So does creating the Gothic in the West, does it then is it defining something that already exists rather than something that's new? And I think that's something worth considering. So the kind of influences on the West, first of all, we have Chinese aesthetics, Chinese sort of ornamental aesthetics, circa 1650 to 1700. So this is before we get what's usually thought of as the first novel, The Castle of Otranto, in 1764. Then after that, 1870s, we have the influence of Japan in aesthetics, art, and ideas of perspective. So there's this flows between. So I think the idea that we're locating the Gothic merely in one place, in one time, perhaps is problematic. So I kind of want to say that it's something that pre-exists the naming of it, and that the kind of origins of the Gothic come not only from the West but elsewhere. If that makes sense, I hope. So later on, we have the work of Eduardo Rampo, who took his name from Edgar Allan Poe. So it sounds the same in transliteration. And he was a writer of what's called Yuroguro, which is erotic, grotesque work. And he was hugely influenced by Edgar Allan Poe. So we can see here this book, the Edgar Allan Poe of Japan. His tales have also been translated into English with Tales of Mystery and Imagination. They've been called Gothic tales. So Gothic also exists, and I've argued this elsewhere, as a kind of marketing tool to present people outside of Japan and elsewhere with something that they recognize. So the complications, so Rampo was 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I did some work on Dracula in another piece of work. And Bram Stoker's Dracula was translated in the 1940s in Japan. So there's kind of interesting, I think, connections or flows between, rather than this kind of very static binary. So I want to move from that into this notion of the fox with nine tails, the fairy fox, the fox maiden. And this is something that we see across Asian cultures. Now, I've only written about it in terms of Japan, China, and Korea. That's right. But I think I was looking at some work, and you also find it in, I think, Vietnam. So I need to look a bit wider. And the very first mention of this is in the classic Mountains and Seas, where they talk about the animal, which is a fox, which has nine tails, and it eats man. So this notion of cannibalism, eating human flesh, is key to the representation and presentation of the fox with nine tails. However, if a human eats it, then you become immune to bewitching poison. So, and the classic tales brought together numerous discussions of mountains, distant seas, exotic flora and fauna, and legendary creatures. And one of the creatures that's most mentioned is the fox with 9 tails. So this is a Chinese classic. So at the moment we're looking at China and perhaps the origins of this particular creature. So this is a 9-tailed fox drawn by Xiling, and the idea of the fox is that it can transform. That often foxes want to be human or celestial. So it's interesting because in some ways the kind of ultimate form for a 9-tailed fox is being human. So the fox is called Hu Ling Jing, which is the word for essence. The Hu Ling Jing is believed to be a creature of yin that consumes masculine yang energy. So yin is feminine energy, yang is masculine energy. So Hu Jing is used in terms of a dangerous power held by those with seductive beauty, and has all the kind of negative connotations of licentiousness. And so we get the figure of almost like the femme fatale within this fox-like creature. And if we look at the kind of image, it has feminine characteristics. So the characteristic that remains the same across the countries I've looked at is the ability of the fox to shapeshift. So they can be women, they can be translucent ghosts. We can have a fox when it reaches the age of 50, they can transform into a human viewer. Then 100 years, they can turn into a beautiful lady, but also a human man. So there's no kind of fix as to the transformations. It's kind of continuing transformation. However, when it reaches 1,000 years, there's this notion that the fox ascends to heaven. But in the Gumiho dramas, it's about wanting to be human, not about ascending to heaven. So this notion of a celestial being is tied in to this particular representation. So the first stories about this, or the most kind of famous ones, are by Pu Songling in Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. And the one I got is the translation and edited by John Minford. There are other variations. There's also picture books on particular stories. So Minford talking about it says about fox spirits are connected to sex and sexuality. So like the female fox spirit will suck all the yang out of her victims in order to remain human, or in order to maintain her form. So the fox is closely linked with sexuality and becomes a way of discussing eroticism and relationships between men and women, but seeing women as dangerous in that they will suck all the male vitality out of them, leaving nothing left. They signify death. At the same time, some of the stories tell of romances between a fox and a human. Those romances don't necessarily end happily, but romance is one of the key things that we see in the Gumiho drama, and it is kind of a key feature. So if we look at some representations, so this is the 9-tailed fox, which is from the Book of Mountain Seas that I mentioned earlier. In the middle, we've got the kitsune, which is from series Gecko's Muslimi. Yeah, so I wasn't able to identify the Gumiho, this picture, so I need to look that up to identify where it's coming from. But you can see that there's commonalities between these three representations. So in terms of tails, but also in terms of kind of the way in which the fox is presented in almost a kind of feminine manner. I was thinking, and I don't really know where to go with this, or I'm going anywhere with this at all, but whether they're seeing something within the visual aesthetics that links to like a peacock, and whether there's some sort of connection there between the tail and the representation of sexuality and sort of spectacle. So I wonder whether there's some kind of link there, but I'm not sure at the moment. So we're going to go on to a short video from Netflix, which will define the Gumiho, or define the Gumiho insofar as the programs that you can find on Netflix. But I thought it was really useful, and it's a lot more interesting than me talking you through it. Okay. Okay. So that kind of gives a good idea of what I think the Gumiho is and how it's represented. It has evolved over time. So one of the series is quite old, whereas the other ones are very new. One of the first series was Fox with Nine Tails, Forbidden Love by KBS2 2004, and that was 16 episodes. So the thing about K-drama in Korea is that you have the main networks and then you have the kind of independent ones. So KBS2 is one of the biggest program satellite network, and it has 16 episodes. And so generally these dramas have between 12 and 16 episodes. So traditionally there were any sequels to drama, so it would be contained within sort of 12 to 16 episodes. And I said that at the beginning, but I think what we're seeing is a slight change where we are getting sequels or prequels to dramas, more in the kind of Western model. I want to show a quick clip from this because it's kind of very different to the ones we saw on the Netflix, and it's about 30 seconds. This was an attempt to get the kind of young demographic. So this is a young adult program. And so it has elements of action horror with tragic melodrama. And the notion of forbidden love is key to the genre. So often that you have a romance between a Gumiho and a human, and that's forbidden. And what's been this motive of star-crossed lovers that we see a lot in Asian, East and Southeast Asian dramas and films. The idea that you can't be together because you're a different species is key to the genre, but also there are ways of kind of overcoming that. So this is more action orientated, and you can also see that it's this notion of intra-Asian referencing that Ibuchi talks about, where programs are made not just to be shown in Korea, but also to be shown in Japan and to be shown in China. And so they contain elements that we recognize elsewhere. So the action, the kung fu, is something that we associate with Japan. And I think this is one of the only kind of programs that tries this. The others tend to avoid this kind of young adult approach. But I think that's partly because notions of what is young adult have changed over the years. So we move on to 2010, Insane Network, and it's Grudge, The Revolt of Gumiho. So another thing, key to the drama, which can be seen as very Korean, is this notion of revenge. So seen any kind of East Asian ghost films, you have like the vengeful female ghost who takes revenge on those that killed her. And that is a kind of a key motive. And we associate revenge with Korean cinema. So Old Boy, which really brought Korean cinema to the eyes of the world, if you like, through Quentin Tarantino, is a revenge drama. And the work of Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook and Kim Lee-won are very much within that tradition of revenge dramas. So we have this notion of revenge, and we also have in this series the notion of hybridity. So a child is born that is half human and half fox, and we get that in kind of later series as well. The next one, 2010 as well, is on another main network, SBS, 16 episodes. My Girlfriend is a Gumiho. So here we have a very rich young man who meets this beautiful young woman who turns out to be a Gumiho. And the series tells of their kind of relationship in a typical romance kind of way. The most popular K-dramas are the romantic K-dramas. And the most popular Korean films are the romantic or the romantic comedy, not kind of the horror, not even the revenge dramas. That's not what a lot of people watch. Then we go on to Gu Family Book, which we saw extracts from that on the Netflix, which was another mainstream network, MBC, 2013, and that had 24 episodes. That was quite long. If you want to look at Chinese dramas about magical foxes, they are much, much longer. You would have about 60, 80 episodes, and they don't contain the eroticism. So the idea of the fox is an erotic figure, and the passing of the bead is a sexual act, is a metaphor for a sexual act. So it's very Freudian in lots of ways, kind of like a displacement. So what we see is not what is referenced there, and the idea of the marble or bead that contains all the power and energy is an obvious metaphor for semen. So, but in the Chinese versions, it's very much about romance, and it's not really about sex at all. So it's much more conventional, certainly in the ones that I've seen. So I'm not talking about Hong Kong variations of them, which are different. There's a series of films called the Erotic Ghost Stories, which are based upon foxes and are very much portray women as, in terms of sexuality, in terms of eroticism. But what's interesting with those films is it very much tells the story of desire from the female perspective and through the female gaze, which makes it really, really interesting. But mainland Chinese dramas don't do that. And in Hong Kong cinema or TV these days, because it's under the same regulations as China, it's much more difficult to make things like the Erotic Ghost Story. It's like almost impossible to do that. So then we move on to the kind of series that made me really excited about the genre and that I really loved. And so I watched quite a lot of Korean dramas, but I love this so much. I thought it was so well done. I really liked the characters. But in Tale of the Nine Tails, the protagonist is a mountain deity who leaves his mountain, which gets burnt up, all the vegetation gets burnt, and it seeks revenge. And so revenge is a key narrative to this film. But it reminded me of these the discussion in the comprehensive discussions in the White Tiger Hall, which I think that was 79 CE. So this was 79, this was kind of written in 79 CE in Chinese book. What is the nine-tailed fox? When a fox dies, it turns its head towards the hill where it was born. It does not forget its place of origin. It means that in comfort, a man must not sigh of calamities. And so it seemed to me that this is really operating within this notion of the nine tailed fox as a kind of mountain deity. So those kind of traces go back quite a long way, and then are integrated and repeated and reconfigured within the genre. So I've nearly finished. I wanted to show like a couple of clips from my roommate is a Gumiho, and just very, very short ones. This is the first meeting. So he is a Gumiho who is on the point of becoming human, and he loses his marble, which has all the sucked up energy. And so what's different about this is that the male Gumiho is depicted as sexual and seductive. So he sucks the energy out of the female victims in order to gain power. So it kind of subverts those conventions. So I'm going to play the first clip. It's about 30 seconds. This is first meetup straight away. So I just want to play the second clip again. It's about 30 seconds. So I think those two clips make kind of clear the conventions of the genre. So this notion of romance, but eroticism, and the exchange of what could be called like bodily fluids, if you like, if you think of it in a psychoanalytical sense, but also the notion of comedy, which is central to the genre. The final series that I want to mention, and I'm going to conclude, is Tale of the Nine-Tailed, 1938, which is a sequel, but set back in time. And this is TVN, but also Prime Video. You can watch this on Prime. And this was 12 episodes. So this does away with the romance, which is really, really interesting. And it's much more of an action Gothic period drama. And actually, I think quite a lot of us felt that this was better, that the original was really constrained by those conventions of romance. And, you know, you have to have so many episodes before you have a kiss, and then they've got to be separated and brought back. And it doesn't have that. I think partly because the lead actress wasn't available for the sequel. But I think it made it better to take that out of it. So it becomes much more of an action drama, like the very first show we looked at. So what is the Gothic Gumiho? So this is kind of my thoughts. It might often, but not always, be set in the present. Much of what happens is set in the past. So this notion of reincarnation and repetition of lives is key to East Asian Gothic, and we find in the Gothic Gumiho drama. If it's set in the past, for example, Gu family book, it draws on the Sejek, which is a particular type of Korean historical drama, which is usually set in the dynastic periods of Korea. The Gumiho can be either male or female. If it's female, it tends to operate within traditional conceptions of the fox's seductive woman, seductive femme fatale. So my roommate is a Gumiho subverts those conventions, but in the Tale of the Nine-Tailed, King Yong-il, which is one of the subsidiaries for the second couple, if you like, is represented as ferocious, as needing to be tamed, as needing to be controlled. And so you have this idea of the kind of, not the monstrous feminine, but the unruly feminine, whereas the male foxes are much more controlled. At the centre of the narrative is a doomed romance by star-crossed lovers. But if this romance cannot be fulfilled in the present, then it will be fulfilled in the future. And this is what they do. And so this is specifically in East Asian Gothic, but also in Southeastern Gothic, where you believe in the cosmology and where your soulmate, you can be reincarnated in time to come together with your soulmate. Doesn't always work. There's a Hong Kong film called Rouge, which is a great film, really worth trying finding out, and there it has that narrative, but it doesn't, it ends in tragedy. So hybridity is a key feature. So often we have comedy and horror. So it's a mixture of comedy, horror, romance, action. I haven't seen a cameo drama that is just horror. Whereas I watched The Frog the other day, which is Korean drama, which had no comedy in it, was just unremitting bleakness. So you do have dramas that do that, but not the ones I've seen here. So marked by intra-Asian referencing, so referencing traits that come from elsewhere, particularly China, but then kind of mediated through Japan. The motive of the fox marble is central to all of variations on the genre. And I think the closest Western supernatural creature is the vampire, although I've argued that the hopping zombie is very close to the Western vampire. But I think it's this, the foxes, with kind of taking energy out of its victims and controlling its victims through hypnosis. So I think this is much more similar to that. So the cameo can also be interpreted as variation on the iconic female ghosts that we know through dramas and films. It operates within a cosmology wherein gender is defined by yin-yang, with yin associated with death, either the little death or death itself. So there used to be within cosmology, it was about balance. So if it came out of balance, that was the problem. But later on, the things kind of got formalized as kind of binary opposites. It operates and perhaps reinforces patriarchal privilege and gender roles. Now, not always, not in the work of the Hong sisters, but a lot of the time, this is my thing about The Tale of the Untold, was that it does operate in very conventional ways. So, and there's a reading list, and I'm done. That was okay, that's 40 minutes.